The morning Rebecca Matthews discovered her husband's lifeless body in their Colorado ranch house, the wind stopped blowing for the first time in 30 years. Neighbors would later say they'd never experienced such an unnatural stillness as if the earth itself was holding its breath. What they didn't know was that somewhere in those silent mountains, an ancient spirit had been waiting centuries for that exact moment of perfect grief to finally bridge two worlds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca's hands trembled as she pressed her palm against the cold kitchen window, watching the motionless aspen leaves that should have been dancing in the morning breeze. Behind her, the coffee Thomas had started brewing still gurgled in the machine, a cruel reminder that life had continued its mechanical rhythm. Even after his heart had stopped beating sometime during the night, the paramedics had already taken his body. The sheriff had asked his questions. The neighbors had brought casserole she wouldn't eat. Now in the suffocating quiet of her empty house, Rebecca felt the weight of 43 years of marriage pressing down on her chest like a stone. She had met Thomas when she was 19, fresh out of nursing school and full of dreams about healing people. He was 22, a geology student who could identify every rock formation in Colorado and spoke about the mountains like they were old friends. Their first day had been a hike up Bear Creek Trail where he'd pointed out fossilized shells embedded in limestone and explained how these peaks had once been the bottom of an ancient sea. Everything changes, he'd told her that day, his hand warm in hers as they stood on a windswept ridge. But the bones of the earth remember everything. Now, 67 years old and alone for the first time since her teens, Rebecca wondered what the earth remembered about her grief. The funeral arrangements consumed 3 days of her life in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Thomas had wanted to be cremated, his ashes scattered from Lookout Point where they'd shared their first kiss. The service would be small, just family and a handful of friends who were still alive. Their daughter Sarah had flown in from Seattle. Their son Marcus from Denver, both hovering around Rebecca with the helpless concern of adults who'd suddenly realized their mother was mortal. "Mom, you can't stay in this big house alone," Sarah said for the 10th time as they sat in the funeral home, selecting prayer cards Rebecca knew Thomas would have mocked gently. He'd never been religious, preferring to find his spirituality in geology textbooks and sunrise views from mountain peaks. "I've lived here for 38 years, Rebecca replied, signing another form. "This is where your father and I built our life, but it's so isolated," Marcus added. "The nearest neighbor is 2 miles away. What if something happens?" Rebecca looked at her children, both successful, both worried, both eager to solve their grief by rearranging her life into something more manageable. They meant well, but they couldn't understand that the isolation they feared was exactly what she needed. In town, people would watch her with careful eyes, measuring her recovery, timing her healing. Out here, with only the mountains and the wind as witnesses, she could fall apart properly. The service was held on a Thursday morning under a gray October sky. Reverend Harrison spoke about eternal rest in God's plan, words that felt foreign in the context of Thomas's practical, earthbound life. When it came time for eulogies, Rebecca found herself talking about his hands instead of his heart, how they'd been permanently stained with soil from his garden, how he could coax life from the most stubborn ground, how he'd taught her to read. The stories written in rock layers and tree rings. Afterward, as the small gathering climbed the winding trail to Lookout Point, Rebecca carried the wooden box containing Thomas's ashes and felt the familiar weight of his presence one last time. The wind had returned sometime during the funeral service, and now it whipped through the pines with an almost violent intensity, as if making up for its 3-day absence. At the overlook, Rebecca opened the box with steady hands, while her family formed a protective circle around her. Thomas's ashes were surprisingly heavy, and as she lifted them toward the wind, she whispered the words she'd been rehearsing for days. Go find your fossils, old man. Go back to the bones of the earth. The wind caught the ashes and scattered them across the valley in a gray cloud that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. For a moment, Rebecca could swear she heard his voice in the rustling of the aspen leaves. Not words, exactly, but the familiar cadence of his breathing when he slept beside her. Then the moment passed, and she was just a widow standing on a mountain, watching the last physical traces of her husband disappear into the Colorado sky. Sarah and Marcus stayed for another week, filling the house with nervous energy and forced conversations about practical matters. They sorted through Thomas's clothes, packed up his geological specimens, and made lists of household repairs that Rebecca had managed perfectly well on her own for decades. When they finally left, promising to call every day and visit soon, Rebecca stood in her driveway and watched their rental car disappear down the mountain road with a mixture of relief and terror. That night, alone in the house for the first time since Thomas's death, Rebecca discovered that grief was not the gentle sadness she'd expected. It was a living thing with teeth and claws, something that paced through her chest like a caged animal. She tried watching television, but the laugh track sounded obscene. She tried reading, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. Finally, she put on Thomas's old jacket and walked out into the darkness. The night air was sharp with the promise of winter, and overhead, the stars blazed with the clarity that only came at high altitude. Rebecca had always loved the night sky from their mountain home. Thomas had taught her to identify constellations, and planets had surprised her with a telescope on their 10th anniversary. Now looking up at the familiar patterns, she felt unmoored, as if gravity had loosened its hold on her. She found herself walking toward the old cabin that sat on the far edge of their property, a structure that had been there long before they'd bought the land. Thomas had researched its history and discovered it had been built in the 1880s by a mining family, later abandoned when the silver veins played out. They'd talked about renovating it someday, turning it into a guest house or workshop, but somehow there had never been time. The cabin was small and weathered, its log walls silvered by decades of mountain weather. The door hung slightly ajar, and as Rebecca approached, she could hear the wind moving through the empty rooms like breath through broken lungs. She'd never spent much time here. Something about the place had always made her uneasy, though she'd never been able to explain why. Tonight, though, the cabin seemed to be calling to her. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the single room. The space was empty except for an old stone fireplace and a few pieces of abandoned furniture covered in dust and mouse droppings. But there was something else here too, a sense of presence that made the hair on her arms stand up. Rebecca had never believed in ghosts, had always dismissed such ideas as wishful thinking or overactive imagination. But standing in that cabin, she could feel something watching her from the shadows, something that radiated a kind of patient sadness that matched her own. "Hello?" she whispered, feeling foolish even as the word left her lips. The wind through the broken windows was her only answer, but somehow it sounded less random now, more purposeful. Rebecca backed toward the door, suddenly afraid of what she might find if she stayed longer. Over the following weeks, Rebecca fell into a routine that would have worried her children if they'd known about it. She woke each morning before dawn and made coffee for two, forgetting for those first conscious moments that Thomas was gone. She ate little and spoke to no one except the grocery store clerk on her weekly trips to town. Most evenings she found herself drawn back to the old cabin, where she would sit on the front step and talk to the wind about her loneliness. At first, she told herself she was just processing her grief, working through her emotions in the privacy of the mountains. But gradually, she began to suspect that something in that cabin was listening to her. The wind seemed to respond to her voice, picking up when she spoke and settling to whispers when she fell silent. Sometimes she could swear she heard echoes in the gusts that moved through the pines, not words exactly, but patterns that suggested meaning. November brought the first serious snow, and with it, a new depth to Rebecca's isolation. The road to town became treacherous, requiring chains and careful driving, even in her four-wheel drive truck. Her children called daily, their voices tinny and distant through the phone, full of concern about her safety and mental state. "Mom, this is crazy," Sarah said during one of their evening conversations. "You're completely cut off up there. What if you fall? What if the power goes out? What if you get sick?" "I'm fine," Rebecca insisted, even though she'd lost 15 pounds and barely recognized herself in the bathroom mirror. "I need this time alone." "Dad wouldn't want you to waste away up there," Marcus added, his voice tight with frustration. "He'd want you to live." But Rebecca wasn't sure she wanted to live. Living required energy she no longer possessed, hope she couldn't manufacture. What she wanted was to understand the ache in her chest, to find some way to carry the weight of 43 years of shared life without Thomas there to help bear the load. One evening in late November, as snow fell thick and heavy outside her windows, Rebecca wrapped herself in Thomas's jacket and made her way to the cabin through knee-deep drifts. The world was muffled and white, so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. When she reached the cabin, she brushed snow from the front step and sat down heavily, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I don't know how to do this," she said to the darkness. "I don't know how to be Rebecca without Thomas." The wind stirred the snow around her feet, and for the first time, Rebecca thought she heard something that sounded almost like a voice, low and warm. Speaking words she couldn't quite understand, she leaned forward, straining to listen, but there was only the whisper of snow against wood and the distant creaking of pine branches. Still, something had changed in the air around her, a shift in the quality of the silence that made her skin prickle with awareness. "Who are you?" she whispered. This time, the answer came not as sound, but as feeling, a presence that settled around her like invisible arms, warm despite the freezing air. Rebecca closed her eyes and let herself sink into that embrace, the first comfort she'd felt since Thomas died. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When she opened her eyes again, the snow had stopped falling, and the stars were visible through breaks in the clouds. She could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and still, watching her with patient eyes. But when she blinked, there was nothing there except shadows and snow-laden trees. Rebecca walked home that night with the strange sensation that she was no longer alone on the mountain. Something had heard her grief and answered it, though she couldn't yet understand what that meant or what would come next. As December approached and the first winter storms began to howl down from the peaks, Rebecca found herself spending more and more time at the cabin, drawn by a presence she was finally ready to acknowledge might be real. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in nursing school to trust evidence and scientific explanation, insisted she was simply projecting her need for comfort onto natural phenomena. But late at night, when the wind spoke through the cabin walls in patterns that sounded almost like language, Rebecca began to wonder if there were kinds of reality that couldn't be measured in textbooks or explained by logic. Thomas had always said the mountains held memories in their bones. Perhaps some of those memories were still alive, still listening, still capable of love. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing blizzards that transformed Rebecca's mountain into an Arctic wilderness. The storms came in waves, each one more violent than the last, piling snow against her windows and turning her world into a crystalline prison. Most people would have felt trapped, but Rebecca discovered a strange peace in the enforced solitude. The outside world, with its expectations and well-meaning interference, simply ceased to exist. During the brief lulls between storms, she would struggle through the drifts to reach the cabin, compelled by something she couldn't name. Each visit revealed new details about the presence that shared her vigil. It had moods, she realized, sometimes playful, stirring the snow into spirals around her feet, other times melancholy, filling the air with a sadness so profound it made her weep without knowing why. On the winter solstice, Rebecca made her way to the cabin carrying a thermos of hot coffee and Thomas's old camping lantern. The longest night of the year seemed appropriate for whatever conversation was trying to unfold between them. She settled onto the snow-covered step, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and spoke into the crystalline silence. "I've been thinking about what you might want from me," she said, her breath forming clouds that dissipated slowly in the still air. "Thomas always said the mountains remember everything. Maybe you've been waiting here, remembering something I need to know." The response came as a shift in the wind patterns, a subtle change in pressure that made her ears pop slightly. Then, impossibly, she heard it, not words exactly, but something that carried meaning directly to her mind. The presence was old. Older than the cabin, older than the mining claims and settlers who'd carved their brief lives into this landscape. It had been waiting, but not for her specifically. For someone like her. Someone whose grief ran deep enough to breach the barrier between worlds. Rebecca set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "You're not from my time, are you?" This time the answer came with images that flickered behind her closed eyelids, visions of the valley as it had been centuries ago, before roads and power lines and the scars of human ambition. She saw vast herds of elk moving through meadows thick with wildflowers, rivers running crystal clear and full of fish, and mountains that stood pristine under endless skies. And she saw him. The figure emerged from her, visions like morning mist, taking human form, tall and lean, with copper skin and dark hair that moved in a wind she couldn't feel. His clothes were leather and fur, decorated with beadwork that caught light like captured stars. When he looked at her across the centuries, his eyes held the weight of loss that matched her own. Rebecca's rational mind recoiled from what she was experiencing. Hallucinations, she told herself. Grief-induced psychosis. But her heart recognized something true in the images flooding her consciousness, something that transcended logic and demanded acceptance. "What's your name?" she whispered. The answer came not as sound, but as knowledge suddenly present in her mind. Ayana, meaning eternal blossom in a language she'd never learned, but somehow understood. He had been a warrior of the Ute people, a protector and hunter who'd ranged across these mountains when they belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. "Ayana," she repeated, and felt the rightness of it on her tongue. More images flowed through her awareness, Ayana's life unfolding in glimpses that felt more real than her own memories. She saw him as a young man, learning to track elk through deep snow, his father teaching him to read the stories written in animal sign and weather patterns. She witnessed his first successful hunt, the pride in his mother's eyes as the tribe welcomed him as a full warrior. She felt his joy during the summer gatherings, when multiple bands would come together for trade and celebration, when he would dance around fires that seemed to touch the stars, but woven through these moments of brightness was a thread of growing darkness, white settlers pushing into traditional hunting grounds, conflicts that started as misunderstandings and escalated into violence, treaties made and broken like brittle twigs, the slow realization that his people's way of life was ending, that the world was changing too rapidly for adaptation. Rebecca found herself crying for losses that weren't her own, grieving for a man who'd died more than a century before she was born. Through their strange connection, she felt Ayana's confusion and rage as his people were forced onto reservations, his despair as children were taken to distant schools, to have their heritage beaten out of them, his helplessness as the sacred places of his ancestors were carved up and sold to strangers. The final images came at a rush that left her gasping. Ayana at 32, leading a small band of warriors in a last desperate attempt to protect their remaining territory. The ambush in a narrow canyon, the overwhelming force of cavalry soldiers with their superior weapons. The moment when Ayana realized they were outnumbered and outgunned, that this would be their final stand, she felt his decision not to flee or surrender, but to hold the pass long enough for the women and children to escape deeper into the mountains. She experienced his last battle through his eyes, the weight of his weapons in his hands, the taste of blood and gunpowder in the air. And finally, his death, not as an ending, but as a transformation, his spirit choosing to remain bound to these mountains rather than follow the path of his ancestors to whatever lay beyond. "You've been here all this time," Rebecca breathed, understanding flooding through her. Waiting. Ayana's presence wrapped around her like an embrace, and she felt his loneliness, a century and a half of watching the world change, of seeing his sacred places desecrated by people who treated the land as commodity rather than living being. He had witnessed the construction of mines and roads, the arrival of ranchers and tourists, the gradual transformation of wilderness into something managed and controlled. But he had also seen moments of beauty that sustained him, sunrises that painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, storms that reminded him of the mountain's eternal power, wildlife that continued to follow the ancient patterns despite human interference. And occasionally, very rarely, he encountered people who understood that they were visitors in a landscape far older and wiser than themselves. Thomas had been one of those people. Rebecca realized now why her husband had always spoken of the mountains with such reverence, why he'd spent hours studying rock formations and geological processes. Somehow, without ever seeing or speaking to Ayana directly, Thomas had sensed the presence watching from the peaks and had lived his life in a way that honored that awareness. "He knew about you," Rebecca said, and felt Ayana's confirmation like warm honey in her veins. Through their connection, she experienced Tamuzz's death from Ayana's perspective, the moment when her husband's spirit had paused on its journey to whatever came next, long enough to acknowledge the guardian who'd watched over their home for so many years. Thomas had known, in those final moments, that Rebecca would need something beyond human comfort to survive her grief. That's when Ayana had begun to stir from his century-long vigil, drawn by the intensity of Rebecca's sorrow and Thomas's unspoken request for protection. The silence that had fallen over the mountains the morning she found Thomas's body hadn't been coincidence. It had been Ayana gathering his strength, preparing to bridge the gap between worlds. "So you're not really a ghost," Rebecca said, understanding growing in her mind like dawn light. "You're something else. Something that chose to stay." The distinction felt important, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone else. Ghosts, as she understood them, were trapped by unfinished business or trauma, replaying their earthly dramas in endless loops. But Ayana was something different, a consciousness that had voluntarily bound itself to this place, becoming part of its essence while retaining his individual identity. Over the following weeks, their communication deepened and evolved. What had begun as vague sensations and half-heard whispers developed into something approaching conversation. Ayana couldn't speak in words. That bridge between worlds had limitations, but he could share emotions, memories, and concepts that Rebecca's mind translated into understanding. She learned that he experienced time differently now, that days and seasons flowed around him like water around a stone. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen the land heal from wounds, and adapt to changes, had observed the endless cycle of growth and decay that governed all living things. From his perspective, human lives were brief flames that flickered and died, but the grief and love and hope they contained echoed long after their bodies returned to dust. Rebecca found herself sharing her own memories in return, not just of Thomas, but of her entire life. She told Ayana about growing up in a small farming town, about her decision to become a nurse, about the satisfaction she'd found in healing people and easing their passage through difficult times. She described her children's births, their first steps, their graduations and marriages, and the grandchildren she rarely saw. Most of all, she talked about Thomas, Not just their love story, but the small daily intimacies that had sustained their marriage through 4 decades. The way he hummed off-key while shaving. His habit of collecting interesting rocks on their hikes, filling their house with specimens that meant nothing to anyone else but held worlds of meaning for him. The gentle way he'd corrected her pronunciation of geological terms without making her feel foolish. Through Ayana's presence, she began to understand that these memories weren't burdens to be carried alone, but treasures to be shared. The Ute warrior had lost his entire world, his people, his way of life, his connection to the living community that had given his existence meaning. Yet he had endured by choosing to love the land itself, by finding purpose in protection rather than possession. "You're teaching me how to survive this," Rebecca realized one evening as she sat in the cabin, watching snow fall past the broken windows. "You're showing me that love doesn't end with death." Ayana's response came as a warmth that spread through her chest, a feeling of recognition and relief. He had been waiting not just for someone who could hear him, but for someone who could understand the lesson he'd learned through his long vigil. That grief transformed into guardianship became a form of eternal life, but their connection was beginning to change Rebecca in ways that went beyond emotional healing. She found herself noticing things she'd never seen before, the way moonlight transformed snow into liquid silver, the intricate patterns frost made on her windows, the subtle shifts in air pressure that preceded weather changes. Her senses seemed sharper, more attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. More disturbing were the moments when she could swear she saw the world through Ayana's eyes, the valley as it had been centuries ago, overlaying the present like a double-exposed photograph. These visions were becoming more frequent and more vivid, as if the barrier between her consciousness and his was gradually dissolving. One night in late December, Rebecca woke from dreams of buffalo herds and war paint to find her bedroom filled with the scent of sage and wood smoke. When she went to the window, she saw a figure standing in her yard, not translucent or ghostly, but solid and real, as if Ayana had somehow stepped fully into her world. He was exactly as she'd seen him. In her visions, tall and powerfully built, his dark hair braided with leather cords and small bones. In the moonlight, his skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and when he looked up at her window, his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries and sorrows beyond human comprehension. Rebecca dressed quickly and went outside, her bare feet somehow untroubled by the snow that should have been freezing. Ayana stood motionless as she approached, and when she was close enough to touch him, he spoke not in words, but in a voice that resonated directly in her mind. "The boundary grows thin," he said, and she understood that he meant the barrier. Between life and death, between past and present, between the world of spirits and the realm of flesh. Soon you must choose. "Choose what?" Rebecca asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Whether to return to your life among the living, or to join me in watching over this place until the mountains themselves crumble into dust." Rebecca stared at him, finally understanding the true nature of what had been happening between them. This wasn't just about comfort or healing, it was about transformation, about the possibility of becoming something more than human, something eternal. But it was also about giving up everything that connected her to the mortal world, including any chance of seeing her children or grandchildren again. "How long do I have to decide?" she whispered. Ayana raised his hand toward the eastern peaks, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. "Until the winter solstice returns, one full cycle of seasons. Then the door between worlds will close, and we will both remain as we are, you among the living, me among the eternal guardians." As the sun created the mountains, Ayana began to fade like mist before wind, but his final words lingered in the air around her. "Choose wisely, Rebecca Matthews. Some kinds of love transcend death, but they require sacrifice that cannot be undone." Rebecca stood alone in her yard as morning light transformed the snow into fields of diamond dust. knowing that her life had just taken a turn towards something that had no name, any language she knew. The revelation of Ayana's ultimatum transformed Rebecca's winter solitude into something far more complex than simple grief. She now carried the weight of an impossible decision, one that would determine not just the remainder of her mortal life, but potentially her eternal existence. The knowledge that she had until the next winter solstice to choose created a countdown that pulsed through her days like a second heartbeat. That January brought a different kind of cold, one that seemed to penetrate her bones, regardless of how high she turned the heat. Rebecca found herself studying her reflection in mirrors, searching for signs of the changes she could feel occurring within her. Her eyes seemed deeper, holding shadows that hadn't been there before. Her hair, once a uniform silver gray, now showed strange streaks of black that her beautician couldn't explain during her rare trips to town. More unsettling were the moments when she would reach for something, and her hand would pass through it like smoke, only to solidify again when she concentrated. These episodes lasted mere seconds, but they left her shaken and increasingly aware that Ayana's world was already claiming pieces of her. The cabin became her sanctuary and her laboratory as she experimented with the boundaries of their connection. She discovered that certain times of dawn and dusk, when light balanced precariously between day and night, allowed for clearer communication. During these liminal hours, Ayana could manifest more solidly, though he remained careful not to fully materialize as he had that December night. "Why did Thomas never see you?" Rebecca asked during one of these twilight conversations, settling onto the cabin step with a cup of tea that steamed in the frigid air. Ayana's presence shifted around her, and she felt his amusement like warm honey. Through their connection, he showed her moments from the past 40 years. Thomas working in his garden while Ayana watched from the tree line. Thomas hiking the mountain trails while the warrior's spirit paralleled his path. Thomas sitting on their porch in the evenings while Ayana listened from the shadows. "He felt me," came the response, not in words but in understanding that bloomed in Rebecca's mind. His respect for this land, his gentleness with the earth, these things created harmony between us. But his spirit was complete, anchored to life, through his love for you. He had no need to see beyond the veil. Rebecca absorbed this knowledge, recognizing the truth in it. Thomas had been content in his mortal existence, fulfilled by their marriage and his work and his deep appreciation for the natural world. Unlike her, he had never experienced the kind of profound displacement that left a person seeking something beyond ordinary reality. "And I do need to see beyond the veil?" she asked. "Your grief opened doorways that your happiness had kept closed." Ayana replied, "Loss creates hollow spaces that can be filled by many different things. You are discovering that love and longing can bridge worlds, but such bridges are not built without cost." As winter deepened, Rebecca began to understand the true nature of that cost. Her connection to Diana was growing stronger, but her ties to the mortal world were simultaneously weakening. Phone calls from her children became increasingly difficult, as their voices seemed to reach her from vast distances. When Sarah visited in February, Rebecca could barely make herself focus on their conversation, finding her daughter's concerns about practical matters, bills, and maintenance and medical checkups almost incomprehensibly trivial. "Mom, you're scaring me," Sarah said on the last day of her visit, cornering Rebecca in the kitchen. "You're different. It's like you're fading away right in front of me." Rebecca looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and was startled to realize that Sarah's features seemed blurred, as if she were viewing her through thick glass. The vibrant young woman who'd been born in this house 41 years ago now appeared somehow less real than the century-dead warrior who visited her dreams. "I'm grieving," Rebecca said, though the word felt inadequate for what she was experiencing. "People change when they lose someone they love. This isn't normal grief, Mom. This is something else entirely. I think you should talk to someone. A counselor, maybe a doctor." There are medications that can help. Help with what? Rebecca interrupted, surprising them both with the sharpness in her voice. Help me forget your father? Help me pretend that 43 years of marriage can be replaced with antidepressants and therapy sessions? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Help you to live again. Help you remember that you still have a family who loves you. But as Rebecca looked at her daughter's worried face, she felt something terrible and liberating. She wasn't sure she did want to live again, at least not in the way Sarah meant. The world of taxes and doctor's appointments and social obligations felt increasingly foreign to her, like a play she'd once performed in but could no longer remember her lines. After Sarah left, Rebecca found herself spending entire days at the cabin, returning to her house only when hunger or cold drove her inside. The boundary between her world and Ayana's continued to blur, allowing for longer and more complex exchanges. He began to share not just memories, but knowledge teachings about the land and its seasons, stories about the animals that denned in winter and the plants that would emerge with spring, wisdom about reading weather patterns and understanding the subtle language of wind and stone. Under his tutelage, Rebecca discovered abilities she'd never suspected. She could sense the health of trees by touching their bark, could predict storms days before they arrived, could track animals through the forest with an accuracy that would have impressed the most experienced hunters. These skills felt natural, as if she were remembering rather than learning, awakening capabilities that had always been present but dormant. One March morning, while examining tracks in the snow near the cabin, Rebecca realized she was no longer alone with Ayana. Other presences moved at the edges of her awareness, ancient spirits who'd been drawn by her growing connection to their world. They were less defined than Ayana, more like emotional impressions than distinct personalities, but she could sense their curiosity and approval. Am I becoming like them? She asked Ayana that evening, gesturing toward the shadows where she could feel the other spirits gathering. You are becoming what you choose to become, he replied. The door between worlds opens for those who are ready to step through it, but the choice to cross the threshold must be made freely. Spring's arrival brought new complications to Rebecca's strange existence. The melting snow revealed changes to the landscape that only she seemed able to see, ancient paths that glowed with silver light, stone circles that predated any historical record, trees marked with symbols that hurt her eyes if she looked at them too directly. The mountains were revealing their secret history to her, sharing mysteries that had been hidden from human sight for generations. But spring also brought visitors. Marcus arrived for Easter weekend, followed by a parade of well-meaning neighbors who decided Rebecca had been isolated too long. Their presence felt like an assault on her transformed senses, their voices too loud, their emotions too chaotic, their very existence somehow abrasive, against the delicate equilibrium she'd achieved with Ayana's world during a particularly difficult dinner party that Marcus had organized without consulting her. Rebecca escaped to the cabin and found Ayana waiting in his most solid manifestation yet. He appeared almost entirely human in the gathering dusk, though starlight seemed to flow beneath his skin like luminous blood. They're trying to pull me back, she told him, collapsing onto the cabin step with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. They love you, Ayana replied, though she could sense his own discomfort with the intrusion of so many mortal lives into their sanctuary. They fear losing you to something they cannot understand. But I'm already lost to them. Aren't I? Even if I chose to return fully to their world, I could never go back to being the Rebecca I was before. Ayana moved closer, and for the first time since their connection began, he reached out to touch her face with fingers that felt solid and warm. Some transformations cannot be undone. You have seen too much, learned too much, felt too deeply to return to ordinary sight. The question is not whether you can go back, but whether you can find peace moving forward. His touch sent shockwaves through Rebecca's system, and suddenly she could see through his eyes with perfect clarity. The world blazed with colors that had no names, with energy that flowed between all living things like visible rivers. She saw the spirits of every creature that had ever died on this mountain, saw the vast network of consciousness that connected every stone and tree and blade of grass. But she also saw the cost of such vision. Ayana's existence was one of eternal watching, of love without possession, of connection without the ability to fully inhabit either world. He belonged everywhere and nowhere, forever caught between the realm of the living and whatever lay beyond. Death, is this what you're offering me? Rebecca whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. An eternity of watching but never truly belonging? I am offering you the chance to become part of something greater than individual existence, Ayana replied. To join the guardians who protect this land and all who dwell upon it. But you must understand such guardianship requires the surrender of personal desires, personal needs, personal connections to the mortal world. Rebecca pulled away from his touch, staggered by the immensity of what he was proposing. She had been thinking of their connection as a choice between life and death, but now she understood it was something far more complex. Ayana wasn't offering her death, he was offering her transformation into something that transcended the usual boundaries of existence. The dinner party was winding down when she returned to the house, and she found Marcus cleaning up in the kitchen while their guests departed. He looked up as she entered, and she saw her own transformation reflected in his startled expression. "Mom, what happened to you out there? You look ... He struggled for words. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rebecca almost laughed at the accuracy of his observation. "Maybe I have," she said quietly. Over the following weeks, as spring advanced toward summer, Rebecca found herself caught between two worlds in ways that became increasingly difficult to manage. Her family's concern deepened as her behavior became more erratic. She would disappear for days at a time, would be found talking to empty air, would make references to people and events that existed only in her connection with Dr. Patricia Huffman, the family physician who'd known Rebecca for 20 years, finally convinced her to come in for an evaluation after Marcus threatened to pursue legal guardianship if she didn't cooperate. "Your children are worried about you," Dr. Huffman said gently, reviewing test results that showed Rebecca to be in perfect physical health, despite her obvious psychological changes. "They're describing behavior that suggests you might be experiencing some form of dissociative episode related to your grief." Rebecca sat in the sterile examination room, surrounded by the tools and technologies of modern medicine, and felt the vast gap between what Dr. Huffman could understand and what she was actually experiencing. How could she explain that she was communing with a century-dead warrior? That she could see the spirits of ancient peoples moving through the mountains? That she was being offered the chance to become something beyond human comprehension? "I'm not having a breakdown," Rebecca said finally. "I'm having a breakthrough. There's a difference." Dr. Huffman prescribed antidepressants and recommended therapy, standard responses to what appeared to be complicated grief. But Rebecca knew that no amount of conventional treatment could address what was happening to her. She was evolving, whether by choice or circumstance, into something that existed outside the normal parameters of human experience. Summer brought the peak of her transformation. By the solstice, Rebecca could remain in Ayana's world for hours at a time, experiencing the mountains as they had existed centuries ago. She hunted with him in spirit form, participated in ceremonies that honored the land and its creatures, learned the songs that called rain and the dances that celebrated the turning of seasons. But each return to her mortal existence became more jarring, more difficult to bear. The modern world seemed increasingly surreal. Its noise and haste and disconnection from natural rhythms felt like a kind of madness. Her children's visits left her drained and confused, their presence a painful reminder of all she would have to abandon if she chose Ayana's path. By autumn, Rebecca understood that her decision was no longer theoretical. The changes in her were accelerating, and she could feel the approaching solstice like a drumbeat in her blood. Soon, very soon, she would have to choose between two forms of existence, neither of which resembled the life she had known before. Thomas died. Standing in the cabin as October painted the aspens gold and red, Rebecca realized that her year of decision was nearly over. The choice that had once seemed impossible now felt inevitable, though she still wasn't certain which path her heart would ultimately demand she take. November arrived with an urgency that Rebecca felt in her bones. The approaching winter solstice, now less than 2 months away, seemed to pulse through every sunrise, every breath of wind, every moment of silence between heartbeats. Her transformation had accelerated beyond anything she could have imagined, and she found herself existing more in Ayana's world than in her own. The physical changes were becoming impossible to hide. Her reflection in mirrors now showed someone decades younger, her silver hair darkening to the black it had been in her youth, her lined face smoothing until she looked barely 40. But more disturbing were the moments when her reflection would flicker, showing not Rebecca Matthews but a woman in buckskin and beadwork, with war paint marking her cheeks and eagle feathers woven into her braids. Dr. Hoffman attributed the apparent age reversal to weight loss and improved posture, though Rebecca could see the confusion in her physician's eyes. Medical science had no framework for what was happening to her body, no explanation for how grief could literally turn back the clock of cellular aging. The changes went deeper than appearance. Rebecca's senses had sharpened to an almost painful degree. She could hear conversations in town from miles away, could smell storms approaching days before they arrived, could taste the emotional residue left by everyone who'd ever walked through her house. Food began to lose its appeal as her body seemed to sustain itself on something other than conventional nutrition. Most significantly, she was losing the ability to see the modern world at all. Power lines and paved roads would flicker in and out of her vision like mirages, while the ancient landscape Ayana knew remained constant and clear. Her house itself was becoming transparent, revealing the original topography beneath its foundation. The hill where a sacred grove had once grown, the creek that had been diverted to accommodate the driveway, the burial ground that lay beneath her garden. These revelations explained the unease she'd always felt about certain parts of her property, the places where Thomas's flowers refused to grow despite his expertise. The land remembered its original purpose, and her heightened perception was allowing her to see that memory made manifest. Sarah arrived unannounced on a gray November morning, finding Rebecca sitting motionless on her front porch, staring at something her daughter couldn't see. To Sarah's eyes, her mother appeared to be gazing at an empty forest, but Rebecca was watching a village that had existed on this spot 3 centuries ago. Children playing between lodge poles, women tending fires, men returning from hunts with fresh meat for the cooking pots. "Mom?" Sarah's voice sounded thin and distant, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "Mom, can you hear me?" Rebecca turned slowly, struggling to focus on her daughter's face. Sarah seemed faded, like a photograph left too long in sunlight, while the Ute children playing at the edge of her vision blazed with vibrant life. "You're becoming transparent," Sarah whispered, reaching out to touch her mother's arm. Her hand passed through Rebecca's shoulder before encountering solid flesh, and she jerked back as if burned. "My God, what's happening to you?" Rebecca tried to explain, but the words that came from her mouth were in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Tongue of Ayana's people, flowing through her lips with perfect fluency. She watched her daughter's face crumple with fear, and realized with crystalline clarity that she was losing the ability to communicate with the living world. That evening, after Sarah had fled back to Seattle with promises to return with help, Rebecca made her way to the cabin through the first snow of the season. She found Ayana waiting for her in his most solid manifestation yet, no longer flickering between visibility and absence, but standing before her as real and present as any living man. "It's accelerating," she said, noting that her words emerged in English again. though she hadn't consciously chosen the language. I'm disappearing from their world faster than I expected. Ayanna stepped closer, and she could see genuine concern in his dark eyes. The barriers between worlds are thinnest in the months before the solstice. Your spirit recognizes that the time of choosing approaches and prepares itself accordingly. But what if I choose to stay in the mortal world? Will I be able to return to being fully human? For the first time since their connection began, Ayanna hesitated before answering. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of uncomfortable truth. The changes that have occurred cannot be completely undone. You have seen too much, experienced too much, to ever again inhabit purely mortal perception. But you could learn to exist primarily in your world, to focus your awareness on human concerns and relationships. At what cost? You would live as a bridge between worlds, never again belonging fully to either. The loneliness would be considerable. Rebecca absorbed this information while watching snow fall through the broken cabin roof. Each flake seemed to carry its own history, the cloud from which it formed, the air currents that had shaped its journey, the earth that waited to receive it. Such perception was both a gift and a curse, she realized. How could she return to the simple pleasure of watching snow fall when she could see the entire cosmic process behind each crystal? And if I choose your world? She asked, though she was beginning to understand that choice too carried prices she hadn't fully considered. You would join the guardians who watch over this land, who protect it from those who would cause harm. But guardianship requires the surrender of personal desires, personal attachments. You would love all things equally and none specifically. Your children, your grandchildren, all the particular loves that make human life meaningful, these would become distant memories, no more significant to you than the affection you might feel for any stranger. The truth of his words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the choice between mortal and immortal existence that she hadn't fully grasped what becoming a guardian would mean. It wasn't just about giving up her human life, it was about surrendering her human heart, her capacity for the specific, fierce, irrational love that made life worth living. You're asking me to stop being myself, she said quietly. I am asking you to become something larger than yourself, Ayanna replied. The choice is not between good and evil, but between different forms of existence, each with its own gifts and limitations. December's arrival brought a crisis that forced Rebecca to confront the immediate consequences of her transformation. Marcus had driven up from Denver with a court order and a team of medical professionals, determined to have his mother declared incompetent and placed in psychiatric care. They arrived on a Tuesday morning to find Rebecca standing in her yard, apparently talking to empty air while snow fell around her like confetti. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the psychiatrist Marcus had hired, observed Rebecca for several hours before rendering her professional opinion. To Dr. Walsh's trained eyes, Rebecca exhibited all the classic symptoms of severe dissociative disorder, complicated by prolonged grief. She spoke to invisible companions, responded to stimuli that weren't there, and showed dramatic personality. Changes that suggested a complete break from reality. But what Dr. Walsh couldn't see, what none of them could see, was Ayanna standing protectively beside Rebecca throughout the examination, his presence a calming anchor in the chaos of medical intervention. She could feel his concern and his growing anger at the intrusion, could sense other spirits gathering at the edges of the property in response to the perceived threat. Mrs. Matthews, Dr. Walsh said gently, your family is very worried about you. They've described behaviors that suggest you might be experiencing some psychological difficulties related to your husband's death. We'd like to help you work through these challenges in a safe, supportive environment. Rebecca looked at the psychiatrist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, who genuinely believed she was offering assistance, and felt the vast gulf between their realities. How could she explain that her psychological difficulties were actually spiritual evolution? that her conversations with invisible companions were more real and meaningful than any exchange she'd had with living humans in months. "I'm not ill," Rebecca said carefully, aware that every word would be weighed for evidence of her competency. "I'm changing." "There's a difference." "Change can be frightening," Dr. Walsh agreed, "especially after a significant loss. But isolation isn't healthy for anyone, and some of the behaviors your children have described suggest you might benefit from professional support." Rebecca felt Ayana's tension spike as two orderlies moved closer, their body language suggesting they were prepared to physically restrain her if necessary. Around the property's perimeter, she could sense the ancient spirits stirring with protective fury. The very air seemed to thicken with supernatural anger, and she realized that forcing her removal could trigger consequences none of these well-meaning people were prepared to handle. "I'll come voluntarily," she said quickly, surprising everyone including herself, "but I need 1 hour to prepare." "Just 1 hour." Dr. Walsh glanced at Marcus, who nodded reluctantly. They were clearly prepared for resistance, not cooperation. And Rebecca's sudden acquiescence had thrown off their carefully planned intervention. "Of course," Dr. Walsh said. "We'll wait in our vehicles while you gather what you need." As soon as they were alone, Rebecca turned to Ayana, who materialized fully despite the daylight. His face was grim with an anger she'd never seen before, and around him the air shimmered with barely contained power. "They cannot take you," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. "The spirits of this place will not permit it. And if they try, what then? Will you reveal yourself to them? Will you terrify them with manifestations? They can't understand. Will you make them think the mountain is haunted?" Ayana's expression shifted as he grasped the implications of her questions. Any supernatural intervention on her behalf would only confirm the medical team's assessment of her mental state. If spirits began manifesting to protect her, it would be seen as evidence of her psychosis rather than proof of her transformation. "Then what do you propose?" he asked. Rebecca moved through her house like a woman in a dream, gathering the few possessions that still held meaning for her: Thomas's wedding ring, a photo of their children as babies, her grandmother's Bible. Each object felt strange in her hands, like artifacts from a civilization she'd once belonged to but could barely remember. "I propose to show them that some forms of madness are indistinguishable from enlightenment," she said finally. "I'll go with them, submit to their tests, let them try to cure me with their medicines and therapies. And when nothing works, when their science fails to explain or treat what I've become, perhaps they'll begin to understand that some realities exist beyond their comprehension. The medications they give you could interfere with our connection," Ayana warned. "Psychiatric drugs are designed to suppress the very sensitivity that allows you to see between worlds." "Then you'll have to find new ways to reach me," Rebecca replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "If our bond is as strong as you claim, it should survive whatever they do to my brain chemistry." As she packed her small suitcase, Rebecca felt something shifting in her understanding of the choice she faced. She had been thinking of the decision as binary: Ayana's world or the mortal realm, transformation or return. But perhaps there was a third option, one that required her to navigate between realities rather than choosing sides. "I'm not abandoning you," she told Ayana as the medical team's patience began to wear thin. "I'm buying us time. They need to see that conventional treatment won't work before they'll be willing to consider alternative explanations for what's happening to me." Ayana's form flickered with uncertainty, and she realized this was the first time their connection had been challenged by external forces. Up until now, their strange romance had existed in isolation, protected by the mountains, remoteness, and her withdrawal from society. But now the modern world was asserting its claim on her, demanding that she conform to its understanding of sanity or accept the consequences. "Promise me you'll wait," Rebecca said, reaching out to touch his face one last time before the orderlies came to escort her to the waiting ambulance. "Promise me that if I find a way back to you, you'll still be here." "I have waited for more than a century," Ayana replied, his form already beginning to fade as the medical team approached the house. "I can wait a little longer." But as Rebecca walked toward the vehicles that would carry her away from the mountains, she felt their connection stretching like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. The farther she moved from the cabin, from the sacred places where their love had flourished, the more distant Ayana's presence became. By the time they reached the main road, she could barely sense him at all, and she realized with growing alarm that their bond might not be as unbreakable as she'd assumed. The psychiatric facility waited ahead of her like a fortress of rationality, designed to cure her of the very perceptions that had given her life meaning. For the first time since Thomas's death, Rebecca felt truly afraid not of dying, but of losing the one connection that had made existence bearable. As the ambulance wound its way down the mountain, she pressed her face to the window and whispered a prayer to the wind, hoping that somewhere in the gathering dusk, a Ute warrior could still hear her voice. Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility squatted like a concrete tumor against the Denver skyline, its sterile walls and barred windows designed to contain minds that wandered too far from accepted reality. Rebecca sat in the intake room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects, while Dr. Walsh reviewed her preliminary psychological assessment. The institutional air recycler hummed constantly, filtering out any trace of natural atmosphere and replacing it with something that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. "We're going to start you on a mild antipsychotic," Dr. Walsh explained, her voice professionally gentle. "Risperidone, along with a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor to help with the underlying depression. Many patients find significant relief within the first few weeks of treatment." Rebecca nodded absently, though her attention was focused on the window behind Dr. Walsh's desk. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains pale blue, smudges on the horizon that called to her with voices only she could hear. Somewhere in those peaks, Ayana waited. She could feel the faintest echo of his presence, like trying to catch a radio signal from another galaxy. The first 3 days at Pine Ridge passed in a haze of medications and therapy sessions designed to realign her perceptions with consensus reality. Dr. Walsh conducted daily interviews, probing Rebecca's beliefs about her supernatural experiences with the patient, thoroughness of someone trying to defuse a bomb. Group therapy sessions introduced her to other residents whose minds had wandered into territories the medical establishment couldn't map. There was Janet, a former accountant who insisted she could communicate with her deceased cat through electrical appliances. Robert, a retired professor who claimed to have discovered mathematical proof of parallel universes overlapping our own. Maria, a young mother who heard angels singing lullabies that no recording equipment could capture. Each patient carried their own version of impossible truth, and each was being systematically medicated back toward acceptable delusion. The antipsychotics worked exactly as advertised. By the end of her first week, Rebecca found her connection to Ayana's world fading like watercolors in rain. The spiritual realm that had become more real to her than physical reality was retreating behind a chemical veil, leaving her stranded in a world of plastic chairs and scheduled meals and concerned faces asking if she felt more like herself yet. But the medications couldn't erase what she had learned, couldn't unknow the truth she had discovered. They could suppress her ability to perceive the supernatural, but they couldn't convince her that her experiences had been hallucinations. Late at night, lying in her narrow bed listening to the electronic hum of monitoring equipment, Rebecca held onto her memories of Ayana like sacred relics. She remembered the warmth of his touch, the depth of his ancient wisdom, the way he had looked at her with eyes that held centuries of accumulated love. Dr. Walsh documented steady improvement in her patient's condition. Rebecca's claims about communicating with spirits decreased significantly. Her affect brightened. She participated in group activities and engaged in rational conversations about her future. To all outward appearances, the treatment was successful. What Dr. Walsh couldn't see was the growing desperation beneath Rebecca's compliant exterior. Every day of medication weakened her connection to the mountains, to Ayana, to the choice that awaited her at the winter solstice. She was losing herself in the most fundamental way possible, not through transformation into something greater, but through reduction to something smaller and more manageable. 2 weeks into her stay, Rebecca met Dr. Elena Vasquez during a chance encounter in the facility's library. Dr. Vasquez was a cultural anthropologist conducting research on supernatural beliefs in contemporary psychiatric settings, and something about Rebecca's case had caught her attention. "I've read your file," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, settling into the chair across from Rebecca's table. "Your description of your experiences shows remarkable consistency with indigenous spiritual traditions, particularly those of the Ute people." Rebecca looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read, a romance novel that felt as foreign to her current existence as a text written in hieroglyphics. Dr. Vasquez was perhaps 50, with salt and pepper hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Dr. Walsh says I'm responding well to treatment," Rebecca replied carefully, aware that their conversation might be monitored. "Dr. Walsh is an excellent psychiatrist," Dr. Vasquez agreed. "But psychiatry tends to pathologize experiences that don't fit within its medical model. Other cultures have different frameworks for understanding communication with spiritual entities." For the first time in weeks, Rebecca felt a spark of hope. "You don't think I'm delusional? I think you've had experiences that are very real too. And that those experiences follow patterns that have been documented across many indigenous cultures. The question isn't whether your experiences are real, it's how we understand and respond to that reality." Dr. Vasquez explained that she was documenting cases where patients reported supernatural encounters that aligned with specific cultural traditions. Rebecca's descriptions of Ayana, of the ancient spirits watching over the mountains, of the choice between worlds, all of these elements appeared in Ute spiritual teachings that Rebecca couldn't possibly have studied in depth. "How could I know things about Ute culture if I just imagined this?" Rebecca asked, leaning forward with an intensity that made other patients glance nervously in their direction. "That's exactly the question that brought me to your case," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Your knowledge of details about Ute spiritual practices, historical events, even linguistic elements, suggests something more complex than simple psychosis." Over the following days, Dr. Vasquez conducted extensive interviews with Rebecca, documenting not just her experiences with Ayana, but the specific cultural knowledge she had somehow acquired. Rebecca found herself able to describe Ute ceremonies she'd never read about, to explain the spiritual significance of geological formations in ways that matched scholarly sources, to sing songs in a language she'd never formally learned. There are documented cases of individuals acquiring knowledge through means that can't be explained by conventional psychology, Dr. Vasquez told her during one of their sessions. Shamanic traditions worldwide recognize that certain people can access information through spiritual communion with deceased individuals or cultural ancestors. The validation of her experiences began to counteract the effects of the medications. While the antipsychotics still suppressed her ability to perceive Ayana directly, Rebecca's conviction in the reality of their connection strengthened. She began to feel him again as a distant presence, like feeling sunlight through heavy clouds. But time was running out. December's arrival brought the sobering realization that the winter solstice was less than 3 weeks away. Rebecca had been at Pine Ridge for nearly a month, and there was no indication that her family or her treatment team were considering her release. Dr. Walsh remained convinced that continued medication and therapy would eventually restore Rebecca to full psychological health. The breakthrough came during a group therapy session led by Dr. Vasquez as part of her research. She had gathered several patients whose experiences included supernatural elements, encouraging them to share their stories without the usual clinical intervention designed to correct their perceptions. As Rebecca listened to Janet describe her conversations with her deceased cat, she realized that every person in the room was describing genuine contact with something beyond ordinary reality. Their experiences varied in detail and cultural context, but the underlying pattern was consistent. They had all found ways to connect with forms of consciousness that existed outside conventional understanding. "What if we're not sick?" Rebecca said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about angelic communications. "What if we're just more sensitive to things that are actually there?" The question hung in the air like incense, and Rebecca could see recognition dawning in several faces around the circle. They had been taught to doubt their perceptions, to see their experiences as symptoms of illness rather than evidence of expanded awareness. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward with interest. "Tell me more about that idea, Rebecca." "Every culture in history has recognized that some people can see and hear things others can't," Rebecca continued, feeling strength flowing back into her voice. "Shamans, mystics, visionaries, they weren't considered mentally ill, they were considered spiritually gifted. When did we decide that ability to perceive beyond ordinary reality was automatically a sign of disease?" The discussion that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in Pine Ridge's group therapy rooms. Patients who had been taught to apologize for their experiences began to claim them as valid forms of perception. Dr. Vasquez documented it all, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her research. That night, Rebecca lay in her bed feeling Ayana's presence more strongly than she had since arriving at the facility. The connection was still muted by medication, still filtered through chemical interference, but it was unmistakably real. Through their bond, she sensed his growing urgency. The solstice approached, and the window for her choice was narrowing. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas's sister Helen had driven down from Wyoming, ostensibly to check on Rebecca's progress, but actually carrying a message she claimed to have received in a dream. "Thomas came to me 3 nights ago," Helen told Rebecca during their supervised visit. "He looked exactly like he did on our wedding day, young and happy and full of life. He told me to tell you that you have to choose what makes you feel most alive, not what makes everyone else comfortable." Dr. Walsh, who was monitoring the visit, frowned at this development. "Helen, I don't think it's helpful to encourage her." "What?" Helen interrupted, her voice sharp with protective anger. "Her grief, her right to find meaning in her husband's death. Thomas loved those mountains more than anywhere on earth. If Rebecca feels connected to him there, who are we to medicate that connection away?" The confrontation forced Dr. Walsh to confront something she'd been avoiding, the possibility that Rebecca's experiences, while unusual, might not require medical intervention. The patient was physically healthy, intellectually intact, and causing no harm to herself or others. Her only symptoms were experiences that fell outside conventional reality but aligned perfectly with documented spiritual traditions. More importantly, Rebecca was approaching the anniversary of Thomas's death, and the 1-year mark often brought significant psychological shifts in grieving individuals. Perhaps what she needed wasn't more medication, but the freedom to complete whatever process she had begun in the mountains. The facility's Christmas party provided Rebecca with the opportunity she'd been waiting for. While patients and staff gathered in the recreation room for holiday festivities, Rebecca slipped away to the small garden behind the building. It was the only place on the property where she could see the mountains clearly, where she could feel even a whisper of the wind that carried Ayana's voice. Standing among the dormant flower beds, Rebecca closed her eyes and reached out with every fiber of her being toward the distant peaks. Through the haze of medication and the interference of urban electromagnetic fields, she found him faint but present, waiting for her with the patience of stone. The connection blazed to life, with an intensity that nearly knocked her to her knees. Suddenly she could see through his eyes, could feel his desperate relief at their reunion, could understand that he had been fighting his own battle to maintain their bond across the miles of separation. The solstice comes in 5 days, his voice whispered through her consciousness. The choice cannot be delayed much longer. I know, Rebecca replied, speaking aloud in the language of his people. But I'm trapped here. They've poisoned my blood with chemicals that cloud my sight. I don't know how to get back to you. Then I will come to you, Ayanna promised, and Rebecca felt the mountain itself stirring in response to his determination. Love that transcends death cannot be defeated by human institutions. The next morning, Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility experienced its first supernatural manifestation in its 40-year history. Patients throughout the building reported dreams of Native American warriors walking the corridors, of eagle songs echoing from the ventilation system, of winds that carried the scent of sage and pine through hermetically sealed windows. Dr. Walsh found Rebecca sitting calmly in her room, apparently unaffected by the disturbances that had the rest of the facility in chaos. Security cameras had malfunctioned during the night, electronic equipment had reset itself, and the building's climate control system was somehow producing breezes that felt like mountain air. Did you have any unusual dreams last night? Dr. Walsh asked, though she was beginning to suspect that Rebecca's presence at Pine Ridge was the catalyst for these inexplicable events. Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile Dr. Walsh had seen from her since her arrival. I dreamed I was going home, she said simply. By evening, it was clear that the facility couldn't contain whatever forces Rebecca had attracted. Supernatural phenomena intensified throughout the day: equipment failures, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and sightings of figures that appeared on security monitors, but couldn't be found during physical searches. Dr. Walsh made the decision. That would change everything. Rebecca Matthews was being discharged effective immediately, her treatment deemed complete, despite the unconventional nature of her recovery. As Rebecca packed her few belongings, she could feel Ayanna's presence. Growing stronger with each mile they would soon put between herself and the urban prison that had nearly claimed her soul. The winter solstice was 4 days away, and she was finally going home to face the choice that would determine the rest of her existence, however long that existence might prove to be. The mountain road had never felt longer or more treacherous. As Marcus drove Rebecca home from Pine Ridge, 3 days before the winter solstice, the December air carried a weight that pressed against the car windows like invisible hands, and the peaks ahead seemed to pulse with an energy that made the hair on Rebecca's arms stand upright. She had been away for 5 weeks, but it felt like returning from another lifetime. The facility called this morning, Marcus said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as they climbed the winding highway. Dr. Walsh wanted to know if you'd experienced any unusual phenomena since your discharge yesterday. Rebecca almost smiled at the carefully neutral way her son approached the subject. During her month at Pine Ridge, supernatural events had followed her release like a wake behind a ship. The hotel where she'd stayed her first night reported electronic disturbances and unexplained temperature drops. The restaurant where Marcus had taken her for breakfast found that their sound system kept playing what the staff described as Indian flute music, despite no such recordings being anywhere in their playlist. What did you tell her? Rebecca asked, watching the familiar landmarks flash past, the granite outcropping where she and Thomas had stopped to watch eagles, the meadow where they'd picnicked on their anniversary, the turnoff to the old mining road where Ayanna's people had once made their final stand. I told her you seemed fine, Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But Mom, if you're still having experiences, maybe you should consider staying with Sarah in Seattle for a while. Just until you feel more stable. Rebecca studied her son's profile, seeing Thomas in the line of his jaw and the stubborn set of his shoulders. Marcus was trying so hard to be supportive, while simultaneously hoping his mother would transform back into someone he could understand. The medications had temporarily dulled her perceptions, but they hadn't changed the fundamental fact that she was no longer the woman who had raised him. "I need to go home," she said quietly, "to the mountain. There are things I have to do before the solstice." Marcus's hands tightened further on the wheel. "Mom, please don't talk like that. You're scaring me." But Rebecca was already turning inward, feeling for the connection she'd almost lost during her imprisonment at Pine Ridge. Ayanna's presence flickered at the edge of her consciousness like a candle flame in wind, stronger with each mile they climbed but still filtered through the lingering effects of psychiatric medication. When they finally reached her house, Rebecca stood in the driveway breathing mountain air that tasted like freedom and possibility. The familiar peaks surrounded her like old friends, and she could feel the ancient spirits stirring in response to her return. During her absence, snow had transformed the landscape into something pristine and otherworldly, erasing the marks of human habitation and revealing the eternal bones of the earth beneath. "I'll stay tonight," Marcus offered, though she could see the reluctance in his eyes. "Make sure you're settling in okay." "No," Rebecca said firmly. "I need to be alone." "But what if something happens? What if you have another episode?" Rebecca turned to face her son fully, letting him see the changes that 5 weeks of medication couldn't disguise. Her eyes held depths that hadn't been there before her time at Pine Ridge, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. "Marcus, I love you. I love Sarah. I love my grandchildren and the life we built together as a family. But I'm not the same person I was when Thomas died, and I'm never going to be that person again. The choice I have to make in 3 days isn't about having episodes or getting better. It's about what kind of existence I'm going to choose for whatever time remains to me." Her son stared at her with the expression of someone watching a beloved landmark crumble before his eyes. "I don't understand what you're saying." "I know you don't," Rebecca replied gently. "And that's not your fault. Some experiences can't be shared, only lived. But I need you to trust that I'm not sick or delusional. I'm just becoming something different." After Marcus left, driving down the mountain with obvious reluctance and repeated promises to call every few hours, Rebecca stood alone in her house feeling like a stranger in her own life. 5 weeks away had allowed her to see her former existence with fresh eyes, and she was struck by how much of it seemed designed to distract from rather than engage with the mystery of being alive. The television with its endless stream of artificial dramas. The kitchen is full of appliances designed to make eating more convenient and less connected to the sources of food. The photographs on the walls that trapped moments of happiness like butterflies pinned to boards. Even her marriage to Thomas, as deep and sustaining as it had been, now seemed like only one movement in a larger symphony that she was just beginning to hear. She walked through the rooms touching objects that had once held meaning: Thomas's geology books, the quilt her grandmother had sewn, the coffee mug that still sat unwashed in the sink from the morning she'd found his body. Each item felt like an artifact from an archaeological dig, evidence of a civilization she'd once belonged to but could no longer inhabit. Outside, night was falling with the particular intensity of high-altitude winter, and Rebecca could feel Ayanna's presence strengthening as darkness claimed the peaks. She put on Thomas's jacket and walked out into air so cold it burned her lungs, following a path she could navigate blindfolded to the old cabin where her transformation had begun. The structure looked different under the weight of accumulated snow, smaller and more fragile than she remembered. But as she approached, Rebecca realized the cabin itself had never been the important thing. It was simply the place where the veil between worlds had grown thin enough for love to cross the boundary between life and death. Ayanna was waiting for her, more solid and present than he'd ever been. The psychiatric medications that had clouded her perceptions for weeks seemed to evaporate in his presence, burned away by the intensity of their reunion. When he reached out to touch her face, his fingers felt warm and completely real against her skin. "You came back to me," he said, and his voice carried wonder, as if he doubted this moment would ever arrive. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Rebecca asked, leaning into his touch with a relief that bordered on euphoria. "I feared the healing people might succeed in breaking what we had built together. Their medicines are powerful in their own way, designed to sever connections that their science cannot explain." Rebecca looked into his ancient eyes and saw her own fears reflected there. During her time at Pine Ridge, both of them had wrestled with the possibility that their bond might not survive the assault of modern psychiatry. But they had underestimated the strength of love that transcended the usual boundaries of existence. "Tell me about the choice," she said, settling beside him on the cabin steps. "I need to understand exactly what you're offering, what I'd be giving up, what I'd become." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, and she could feel him gathering thoughts that spanned centuries. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. To join the Guardians means to surrender individual identity in favor of collective purpose. You would become part of the eternal watch that protects this land and all who dwell upon it. Your love for your children, your memories of Thomas, your human attachments, these would fade until they became like stories you'd heard about someone else's life. And if I choose to remain human, you would retain your individual identity, your personal relationships, your human capacity for specific love. But you would also keep the awareness you've gained, the ability to see between worlds. Living as a bridge between realities is difficult. You would belong fully to neither world, understood completely by either realm. Rebecca absorbed this information while watching snow fall through the gaps in the cabin roof. Each option carried its own form of sacrifice, its own promise of survival. There was no choice that would allow her to have everything she wanted. "There's something else," Ayanna continued, his voice growing even more serious. "Something I haven't told you about the Guardian Path." "What?" "Time moves differently for us. A century passes like a season, a millennium like a year. If you choose to join me, you would watch your children age and die, would see their children and their children's children born and buried, would witness the rise and fall of countless human generations. The specific love you feel for Marcus and Sarah would fade, but the memory of having loved them specifically would endure for thousands of years." The magnitude of what he was describing hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had been thinking of the choice in terms of her immediate future, but Ayanna was talking about geological time, about watching human civilization evolve and change while she remained constant and observant. "How do you bear it?" she whispered. "How do you watch everyone you've ever cared about die and still find reasons to continue?" "By learning to love the pattern instead of the individual threads," Ayanna replied. "By finding meaning in the continuation of life itself rather than in specific lives. It is a different kind of love, broader but less intense, eternal but less immediate." They sat in silence as the implications of his words settled between them. Rebecca understood now why the choice couldn't be made lightly, why it required a full year of transformation and consideration. She wasn't just choosing between life and death, or even between mortal and immortal existence. She was choosing between fundamentally different ways of experiencing love and meaning. "Will you show me?" she asked finally. "Will you let me experience what guardian consciousness feels like before I have to decide?" Ayanna hesitated. Such sharing is intense, and once you've experienced guardian awareness, returning to purely human consciousness becomes more difficult. "I need to know," Rebecca insisted. "I can't make this choice based on descriptions alone." Ayanna nodded slowly, then placed both hands on either side of her face. The contact sent shockwaves through Rebecca's nervous system, and suddenly she was experiencing existence from his perspective. The sensation was overwhelming. Instead of seeing through individual eyes, she was perceiving through the collective consciousness of every guardian spirit that watched over the Rocky Mountain region. She could sense the dreams of hibernating bears, could feel the slow pulse of sap moving through frozen trees, could experience the patient waiting of seeds buried under snow that would bloom again in spring. But more than that, she could perceive the vast web of connections that linked all living things, the way a deer's path through the forest influenced the growth patterns of saplings, the way a hawk's hunting habits affected the behavior of entire rodent populations, the way human activity sent ripples of change through ecological systems that wouldn't be fully felt for generations. From this expanded perspective, individual, human lives appeared as brief flashes of consciousness in an eternal stream. She could see her children as tiny sparks of awareness, beautiful but ephemeral, no more or less significant than any other form of life, struggling to exist and reproduce and find meaning in the brief time allotted to it. The experience lasted only minutes before Ayanna gently severed the connection, but it left Rebecca fundamentally changed. She now understood what guardian consciousness felt like, vast and serene, and utterly without the desperate attachments that made human love both precious and painful. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But it's not human anymore." "No," Ayanna agreed. "It's something larger than a human. Whether that's better or worse depends on what you value most: intensity or eternity, specificity or universality, passionate attachment or serene acceptance." Rebecca stood up abruptly, suddenly needing space to process what she'd experienced. The guardian consciousness had been seductive in its peace, its freedom from the pain and uncertainty that defined human existence. But it had also been empty of the fierce, irrational love that made life worth living. "I need time to think," she said. "Time grows short," Ayanna reminded her. "The solstice is tomorrow night." Rebecca looked at him standing in the falling snow. This ancient warrior who had chosen eternal guardianship over the natural progression toward whatever lay beyond death. For the first time, she wondered if his choice had been born of wisdom or fear, of love for the land or inability to let go of existence entirely. "I know," she said. "By tomorrow night I'll have decided." As she walked back toward her house through the deepening snow, Rebecca carried within her the memory of guardian consciousness, like a seed that might grow into something unimaginably vast. But she also carried the weight of human love, the specific and irreplaceable connections that had defined her life for 67 years. Tomorrow night, she would have to choose between them. And for the first time since this strange journey began, she genuinely didn't know which path her heart would ultimately choose. The winter solstice dawned gray and heavy, with clouds pressing down on the peaks like a blanket of lead. Rebecca woke before sunrise, her body trembling with an energy that had nothing to do with the cold. Today was the day. After a year of transformation, of grief that had become something larger than sorrow, of love that had transcended the boundary between life and death, she would finally choose her path. She moved through her morning routine with the deliberate precision of someone performing a ritual. Coffee brewed in Thomas's favorite mug. Toast buttered exactly the way he'd taught her during their first year of marriage. The newspaper retrieved from the driveway and read cover to cover. Though the words seemed to come from a world so distant, it might as well have been fictional. At noon, Sarah's car pulled into the driveway, followed closely by Marcus's pickup truck. Rebecca had been expecting them. She'd felt their approach like pressure changes before a storm. Her children climbed out of their vehicles with the determined expressions of people preparing for battle, and she realized they'd coordinated this visit, had probably been planning their intervention for days. "Mom," Sarah said as they gathered in the living room, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "we need to talk." Rebecca settled into Thomas's old recliner, noting how strange it felt to occupy his space in the house they'd shared for 4 decades. Her children arranged themselves on the couch across from her like attorneys preparing to present their case. "Dr. Walsh called us yesterday," Marcus began. "She's concerned about your discharge from Pine Ridge. She thinks you might have been released prematurely. The facility reported some very unusual incidents during your stay," Sarah added. "Equipment malfunctions, unexplained phenomena. The staff thinks your presence was somehow triggering these events." Rebecca looked at her children, these two people she'd carried in her body, nursed through childhood illnesses, guided through the complexities of growing up. They were beautiful, and earnest and completely unable to comprehend what was happening to her. The gulf between their reality and hers felt unbridgeable. "What are you asking of me?" she said quietly. "Come to Seattle," Sarah pleaded, "just for a few months. Give yourself time to heal properly, away from whatever's happening up here. There are excellent doctors in Seattle," Marcus added. "Specialists who understand grief-related disorders. You don't have to go through this alone." Rebecca felt a wave of love for them, so intense it took her breath away. These were her children, the greatest achievements of her human existence, and they were offering her exactly what children should offer: safety, care, a return to the familiar patterns that had sustained her for decades. "I can't," she said simply. "Why not?" Sarah's voice cracked with frustration. "Why won't you let us help you? Because what you're offering isn't help, it's retreat. You want me to go back to being the mother you remember, the woman who existed before your father died. But that woman is gone, and no amount of medical intervention or family support can bring her back." Marcus leaned forward, his face intense with the kind of protective anger she remembered from his childhood. "So what's the alternative? Staying up here alone, talking to ghosts, losing touch with reality completely?" "The alternative," Rebecca said carefully, "is accepting that some kinds of transformation can't be reversed. That some experiences change us so fundamentally that we can never return to who we were before." She could see the fear in their eyes, not fear of the supernatural, but fear of losing their mother to something they couldn't fight or understand. They had come prepared to battle mental illness, to marshal the resources of modern medicine, and family love against her delusions. They weren't equipped to deal with the possibility that her experiences might be real. "There's something I need to tell you both," Rebecca continued. "Something that might help you understand why I can't. Simply leave this place and pretend none of this happened." Over the next hour, she told them about Ayanna. Not the sanitized version she might have shared with Dr. Walsh, but the full truth, the growing connection, the visions of his past, the choice between worlds that awaited her decision. She spoke about Thomas's role in bringing them together, about the nature of love that transcends death, about the guardians who watch over the land with patience measured in geological time. Her children listened with expressions that cycled through disbelief, concern, and something approaching terror. When she finished, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush stone. "Mom," Sarah whispered finally, "do you hear yourself? Do you understand how this sounds?" "It sounds impossible," Rebecca agreed, "but impossible things happen every day. Your father used to say that the most extraordinary truth of existence is existence itself, that consciousness can emerge from matter, that love can arise from biochemistry, that meaning can evolve from randomness. Compared to those miracles, communication between souls hardly seems remarkable." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out toward the peaks. "Even if we accepted that you're somehow communicating with something supernatural, what you're describing isn't love, Mom, it's obsession. You're talking about abandoning your family, your life, everything Dad worked to build with you." "Am I?" Rebecca asked. "Or am I talking about choosing to become something that can protect and preserve what he loved most? These mountains, this land, they were sacred to your father. If I become one of their guardians, I'm not abandoning his legacy. I'm fulfilling it." The conversation continued for hours, cycling through arguments and pleas and moments of desperate affection. Sarah cried. Marcus raged. Rebecca explained and defended and tried to help them understand the magnitude of what she faced. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that no amount of discussion would bridge the gap between their realities. As evening approached and the time for her choice drew near, Rebecca finally asked them to leave. "I love you both more than you can possibly imagine," she said, standing at the door as they prepared for the drive back down the mountain. "But tonight I have to make a decision that will determine the rest of my existence, however long that existence might be. I can't make that choice while worrying about your feelings or trying to preserve your comfort." Sarah grabbed her hands, her face wet with tears. "Please, Mom, please don't do anything that will take you away from us forever." "Sweetheart," Rebecca said gently, "I've been away from you since your father died. The woman who raised you, lived in this house for 40 years, who defined herself through her relationships with other people, she's already gone. The question now is what will replace her." After they left, Rebecca stood alone in her house as darkness claimed the mountains. Outside, the wind was rising with an intensity that made the walls creak and the windows rattle. She could feel supernatural forces gathering as the solstice hour approached, not just Ayanna, but the entire community of spirits that watched over these peaks. At 11 o'clock, she put on Thomas's jacket and walked out into the storm. Snow was falling so heavily she could barely see the path to the cabin, but her feet found their way without conscious guidance. The wind howled around her with voices that spoke in languages older than human civilization, and the very air seemed alive with anticipation. Ayanna was waiting for her at the cabin, no longer flickering between visibility and absence, but standing solid and real as any living man. Around him, Rebecca could sense the presence of other guardians, ancient spirits, who had chosen eternal watchfulness over the natural progression toward whatever lay beyond death. "It is time," he said simply. Rebecca looked at him standing in the swirling snow, this warrior who had loved her across the centuries, who had shown her possibilities beyond anything she'd imagined during her years as a mortal woman. Then she looked back toward her house, where the lights still glowed in windows Thomas had installed, where photographs of their children smiled from frames he'd chosen, where 43 years of shared life waited like an accusation or an invitation. "I've made my choice," she said. Ayanna's face remained carefully neutral, but she could feel his tension like electricity in the air around them. "Tell me." Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every moment that had led her to this crossroads. The morning she'd found Thomas's body, the first whisper of wind that had carried Ayanna's voice, the year of transformation that had brought her to understand both the pain and the beauty of existence beyond ordinary human boundaries. "I choose to remain human," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like broken glass. Ayanna's face showed no surprise, but she felt his disappointment like a physical wound. "Why?" he asked. Rebecca opened her eyes and looked at him fully. "Because real love, isn't about finding peace or achieving transcendence. It's about choosing to remain vulnerable, to keep your heart open to loss and pain and the specific, irreplaceable value of individual lives. Guardian consciousness is beautiful, but it's not love as I understand it. It's something else entirely. And you choose the pain of human attachment over the serenity of eternal watching. I choose the possibility of meaning through connection. I choose to love my children and grandchildren exactly as they are, for exactly as long as they exist. I choose to honor Thomas's memory by remaining the kind of person he fell in love with, someone who believes that individual lives matter more than cosmic patterns." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, and she could feel the other spirits stirring restlessly around them. Finally he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, "and I accept your choice. What happens now?" Rebecca asked, "Do we just say goodbye?" Now you return to your life among the living, and I return to my vigil among the eternal. But what we've shared cannot be undone, cannot be forgotten. You will always carry a piece of my world within you, and I will always remember what it felt like to love someone specific and mortal. Will I see you again? Perhaps. When you are very old and ready for your final transition, I will be here to help you cross whatever threshold awaits. But until then, you belong to the world of the living. Rebecca felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she looked at him one last time. I love you, Ayanna. I will always love you. And I love you, Rebecca Matthews. Enough to let you go. As she watched, Ayanna began to fade like mist before dawn. The other spirits withdrew their presence, retreating to whatever realms they inhabited between manifestations. The supernatural storm calmed, leaving only ordinary snow falling through ordinary darkness. Rebecca walked back to her house alone, feeling both emptied and strangely complete. She had chosen mortality with all its limitations, had chosen specific love over universal compassion, had chosen the pain of attachment over the peace of transcendence. Inside, she picked up the phone and called her children. I'm staying, she told them. I'm staying human, staying connected to you, staying in the world where individual lives matter more than eternal patterns. But I'm also staying here, in this house, on this mountain. This is where I belong now. The next morning, Rebecca woke to discover that her supernatural abilities had faded, but not disappeared entirely. She could still sense the spiritual currents that flowed through the mountains, could still feel the presence of the guardians who watched from their eternal posts. But these perceptions no longer threatened to overwhelm her human consciousness. She had become exactly what Ayanna had warned her about: a bridge between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but able to navigate both. It was a difficult existence, but it was hers. Spring came early that year, and with it, visitors who had heard about the strange woman who lived alone on the mountain. People experiencing their own grief, their own encounters with the impossible, their own need to understand that love could survive death without requiring the abandonment of life. Rebecca welcomed them all, offering tea and understanding and the hard-won wisdom of someone who had stood at the crossroads between mortality and transcendence and chosen to remain gloriously, painfully, beautifully human, sometimes unclear. Nights when the wind carried the scent of sage and cedar, she would hear Ayanna's voice whispering across the peaks, not speaking to her specifically, but singing the ancient songs that honored the land and all who dwelt upon it. And she would whisper back, sending her love across the boundary between worlds, grateful for what they had shared and what they had each chosen to become. The mountain kept its secrets, as mountains always do. But love had found a way to honor both the eternal and the temporal, both the universal and the specific, both the peace of transcendence and the fierce joy of remaining fully, completely, irreplaceably human. 5 years after the solstice. That changed everything. Rebecca Matthews had become something unprecedented in the Colorado Rockies, a living bridge between the world of the supernatural and the realm of ordinary human existence. Her house had evolved into an unofficial sanctuary for people experiencing encounters they couldn't explain to family, friends, or medical professionals. On this particular March morning, she stood in her kitchen preparing tea for 3 visitors who had arrived before dawn, each carrying their own impossible story. The ritual of hospitality had become as important to her as breathing, the careful selection of herbs, the precise temperature of water, the arrangement of mismatched cups that had belonged to her grandmother. These small acts of service grounded her inhumanity while she helped others navigate experiences that threatened to tear them loose from consensual reality. Her first visitor was Dr. James Thornton, a cardiac surgeon from Denver, whose rationalist worldview had been shattered 6 months earlier. During a routine bypass operation, he had experienced what he could only describe as a visitation from his deceased mentor. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, who had guided his hands through a critical moment when the patient's heart had stopped responding to conventional treatment. She was there, Dr. Thornton said for the third time since arriving, his hands trembling as he accepted the cup Rebecca offered. As real as you are now. She showed me exactly where to place the bypass grafts, warned me about complications that weren't visible on any scan. The patient survived because of her intervention. Rebecca settled into the chair across from him, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his gaze darted constantly toward the windows as if expecting supernatural manifestations to burst through the glass. She had seen this particular form of shock dozens of times, the desperate need to make sense of an experience that violated every assumption about how reality functioned. What happened when you tried to tell your colleagues? She asked gently. Dr. Thornton's laugh was bitter and hollow. I'm on medical leave pending a psychiatric evaluation. The hospital administration thinks I'm having a breakdown caused by overwork and stress. My wife scheduled an appointment with a neurologist to check for brain tumors. Even my children won't return my phone calls. The second visitor, Maria Santos, was a park ranger who had been working in Rocky Mountain National Park. When she began receiving warnings about avalanche conditions from voices that spoke in languages she'd never learned, her supernatural early warning system had saved the lives of at least 12 hikers over the past winter. But her supervisors were growing increasingly concerned about her reports of auditory phenomena that couldn't be verified by other personnel. They think I'm developing schizophrenia, Maria said, wrapping her hands around her teacup as if it were an anchor to sanity. But the voices are never threatening or chaotic like psychiatric symptoms. They're protective, informative. They care about the safety of people in the wilderness. The third visitor was perhaps the most unusual Rebecca had encountered in her 5 years of informal counseling. Father Miguel Restrepo was a Catholic priest whose parish included a significant population of undocumented immigrants. 3 months earlier, he had begun seeing the spirits of people who had died crossing the desert border, souls who appeared to him during Mass, asking him to deliver messages to family members they'd left behind. The church hierarchy is troubled by my reports, Father Restrepo said diplomatically. While Catholic doctrine acknowledges the existence of souls after death, direct communication with the deceased falls outside approved spiritual practices. I've been advised to request transfer to a seminary position where I can reflect on these experiences without the pressures of parish duties. Rebecca listened to each story with the patient attention of someone who understood that being heard was often the first step toward healing. Over the years, she had developed an intuitive sense for distinguishing between genuine supernatural encounters and psychological manifestations of trauma or mental illness. The people who found their way to her mountain sanctuary invariably carried the unmistakable resonance of authentic otherworldly contact. The first thing you need to understand, Rebecca told them, is that you're not alone, you're not crazy, and your experiences are real. The second thing is that having supernatural encounters doesn't make you special or chosen. It makes you sensitive to aspects of reality that most people can't perceive. She moved to the window that looked out toward the peaks where Ayana maintained his eternal vigil. Sometimes, in the right light and weather conditions, she could still see him moving along the ridgelines. Their connection had evolved into something different from romantic love, a deep friendship that transcended the boundaries between life and death, a partnership in helping others navigate the liminal spaces where worlds touched. How do you know so much about this? Dr. Thornton asked. Have you had similar experiences? Rebecca smiled, remembering the woman she'd been 5 years ago, a grieving widow, who thought she was losing her mind when she first heard Ayana's voice on the wind. I had a choice to make between 2 different forms of existence. I chose to remain human, but that choice came with the ability to help others who find themselves standing at similar crossroads. Over the following hours, Rebecca shared practical strategies she developed for living with supernatural sensitivity. How to create boundaries between ordinary consciousness and otherworldly perception. How to ground yourself in physical reality when spiritual experiences threaten to become overwhelming. How to find medical and psychological professionals who could distinguish between mental illness and psychic sensitivity. Most importantly, she taught them how to evaluate the nature and purpose of their supernatural encounters. Benevolent spirits generally offered protection, guidance, or healing. They respected free will and never demanded worship or absolute obedience. Malevolent entities, by contrast, sought to control, manipulate, or harvest energy from the living. Learning to distinguish between these different forms of contact was essential for maintaining both spiritual and psychological health. The dead don't always move on immediately, Rebecca explained as they gathered around her kitchen table. Some remain connected to the physical world because they have unfinished business, messages to deliver, or protective instincts that transcend death. Others stay because they're afraid of what lies beyond, or because their love for specific people or places anchors them to familiar territory. Dr. Thornton leaned forward with the intense focus that had made him a successful surgeon. But why? Can some people perceive them while others can't? Sensitivity to supernatural phenomena appears to be partly inherited and partly developed through experience, Rebecca replied. Trauma, grief, meditation, and proximity to places with strong spiritual history can all increase psychic receptivity. But the most important factor seems to be emotional openness, the willingness to accept that reality includes more than what can be measured by conventional science. Maria Santos nodded vigorously. That makes sense. I started hearing the voices after my grandfather died. He was Navajo, always said the mountains were full of spirits who watched over travelers. I thought his beliefs were just cultural superstition until I began working in the park. Father Restrepo was quietly contemplating the theological implications of Rebecca's explanations. In seminary, we studied reports of saints who claimed direct communication with deceased souls. The Church's position has always been that such experiences require careful discernment to distinguish between divine revelation and demonic deception. Your Church isn't wrong to emphasize discernment, Rebecca agreed. But they're working from the assumption that communication with the dead is always supernatural in origin. What if some forms of after-death consciousness are simply natural phenomena that science hasn't learned to study yet? The conversation continued through the afternoon, ranging from practical advice about managing supernatural experiences to philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of survival after death. Rebecca found herself drawing on knowledge she'd gained not just from her connection with Ayana, but from 5 years of counseling people whose lives had been transformed by encounters with the impossible. Each visitor who found their way to her mountain sanctuary taught her something new about the varieties of otherworldly experience. She'd worked with people who channeled artistic inspiration from deceased masters, parents who received guidance from children who had died young, veterans who were visited by fallen comrades, bearing messages of forgiveness and peace. The range of supernatural encounters was as diverse as human experience itself. As evening approached, Dr. Thornton prepared to return to Denver, where he would face decisions about his medical career and his marriage. Maria planned to drive back to the park headquarters, where she would continue receiving supernatural warnings about wilderness hazards, while pretending her insights came from conventional meteorological analysis. Father Restrepo would return to his parish, where he would struggle to serve his congregation while honoring the messages that came from souls who had died seeking refuge in a foreign land. What you're offering people isn't just comfort, Dr. Thornton observed as he shook Rebecca's hand goodbye. It's permission to trust their own perceptions, to believe that their experiences are valid even when the rest of the world dismisses them as impossible. The most isolating aspect of supernatural encounters is the assumption that you must be either lying or insane, Rebecca replied. Once people understand that others have had similar experiences, that there are frameworks for understanding otherworldly contact, the fear and confusion begin to diminish. After her visitors departed, Rebecca stood on her porch watching the last light fade from the peaks. 5 years of serving as an unofficial counselor for people experiencing supernatural phenomena had taught her that the boundary between worlds was far more permeable than most humans realized. Love, trauma, spiritual seeking, and proximity to places with strong psychic history could all create openings through which otherworldly consciousness could communicate with the living. But she'd also learned that not everyone who experienced supernatural contact was equipped to handle the responsibility it brought. Some people became obsessed with their otherworldly connections, abandoning human relationships in favor of spiritual experiences that provided escape from ordinary life. Others developed messianic complexes, convinced that their supernatural encounters made them specially chosen for cosmic missions. Rebecca's own path had been different. By choosing to remain human while maintaining her connection to Ayana's realm, she had become a translator between worlds, someone who could help others navigate supernatural experiences without losing their grounding in ordinary reality. Night. As she prepared for sleep in the bed she'd once shared with Thomas, Rebecca felt Ayana's presence settling around her like a familiar blanket. Their relationship had evolved beyond romance into something deeper and more sustainable, a partnership that honored both her humanity and his eternal nature. 3 more souls found their way to understanding today, she whispered into the darkness, knowing he would hear her across whatever distance separated the living from the eternal guardians. His response came as a warmth that spread through her consciousness, carrying approval and affection, and something that might have been gratitude. Through their connection, she sensed his satisfaction that their love had found a way to serve purposes larger than individual happiness. Rebecca had discovered that the choice between worlds didn't have to be final or absolute. By remaining human while maintaining supernatural sensitivity, she had created a third option, a life that honored both the specific loves that made existence meaningful and the universal mysteries that gave life deeper purpose. As sleep claimed her, Rebecca dreamed of all the people who would find their way to her mountain sanctuary in the years to come. Each would arrive carrying their own impossible story, their own need for understanding and acceptance. And she would be there to welcome them, to offer tea and wisdom and the hard-won knowledge that love could indeed transcend death without requiring the abandonment of life itself. In her dreams, the mountains sang with voices both ancient and eternal, while somewhere in the distance, a Ute warrior continued his patient vigil over the land and all who sought refuge within its embrace. 20 years had passed since the winter solstice that redefined Rebecca Matthews' existence, and now, at 87, she sat in the same chair where she'd once sipped coffee with Thomas, watching her great-granddaughter chase butterflies in the meadow beyond her porch. The child's laughter carried on the mountain air like music, a sound that validated every choice Rebecca had made in the decades since Ayana first whispered her name on the wind. Emma was Sarah's granddaughter, barely 4 years old, with dark hair that caught sunlight and eyes that seemed to see more than most adults. She had arrived 3 days ago with her mother, Jessica, who was struggling through a difficult divorce and needed the peace that only her grandmother's mountain sanctuary could provide. "Grandma Becca," Emma called, running up the porch steps, with a wild flower clutched in her small fist. "The tall man with the feathers wants to know if you're feeling better today." Rebecca's heart skipped as she accepted the flower from Emma's dirt-stained fingers. "What tall man, sweetheart?" "The one who stands by the old cabin. He has long black hair and pretty clothes with pictures on them. He says he's been watching over us since we got here." Jessica looked up from her laptop with the expression Rebecca had learned to recognize over the years. The mix of confusion and concern that crossed people's faces when children reported seeing things that adults couldn't perceive. Emma has an active imagination, Jessica said apologetically. Ever since the divorce proceedings started, she's been talking about invisible friends. But Rebecca knew better. Children, particularly those under 5, often retain sensitivity to otherworldly presences that most people lost as they aged. Emma was seeing Ayana, which meant the child had inherited the psychic receptivity that seemed to run in certain bloodlines. What does the tall man tell you? Rebecca asked Emma gently. He says the mountains remember everyone who loves them. He says you helped teach him that some kinds of love are stronger than dying. Emma tilted her head with the serious expression children wore when transmitting information they didn't fully understand. He says thank you for choosing to stay with the people who need you. Tears gathered in Rebecca's eyes as she recognized Ayana's words translated through a 4-year-old's vocabulary. After 2 decades of serving as a bridge between worlds, she was finally receiving acknowledgement from the spirit who had started her on this path. That evening, after Emma and Jessica had gone to bed, Rebecca made her way to the old cabin one final time. Her body moved slowly now, requiring the support of the walking stick Marcus had carved for her last Christmas. But her spirit felt as light as mountain air. Ayana was waiting for her, appearing more solid and present than he had in years. Age had not touched him. Of course he remained exactly as he'd been at 32, eternally frozen at the moment of his transformation into a guardian spirit. But something in his bearing suggested that he too had been changed by their decades of connection. You're dying, he said simply, and Rebecca felt no fear at the observation. Yes, she agreed, settling onto the cabin steps with careful attention to her arthritic joints. The doctors think I have perhaps 6 months, maybe less. Cancer had been growing in her liver for the past year, spreading with the patient inevitability of all natural processes. She had chosen to forgo aggressive treatment, preferring to spend her remaining time in the mountains she loved rather than in sterile hospital rooms, fighting a battle she was ready to lose. Are you afraid? Ayana asked. Rebecca considered the question while watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. No, she said finally. Curious, yes. Sad to leave the people I love, certainly, but not afraid. Death has been my companion for 20 years, first through grief, then through helping others navigate their own losses. I know it's not an ending, just a transformation. You could still choose differently, Ayana said quietly. The option remains available to you. You could join the Guardians, become immortal, watch over this land for eternity. Rebecca smiled at the familiar offer. Are you asking because you've been lonely all these years? Perhaps, Ayana admitted. Watching you build your life as a bridge between worlds, seeing the good you've accomplished through choosing humanity, it has made me question my own path sometimes. This confession surprised Rebecca more than anything Ayana had shared during their long relationship. Do you regret becoming a guardian? Not regret exactly. But I wonder sometimes what might have happened if I had chosen to move on when my people were destroyed. If I had trusted that love could survive even the complete transformation of death. Rebecca reached out to touch his hand, marveling as always at the solid warmth of his spirit flesh. You made the choice that felt right for you at the time, with the understanding you had then. I made a different choice with a different understanding. Neither of us was wrong. But your choice bore more fruit, Ayana observed. In the 20 years since you decided to remain human, you've helped more than 300 people navigate supernatural experiences. You've written a book that brings comfort to thousands more. You've raised children who understand that reality includes mystery, and they're passing that wisdom to their own children. Rebecca nodded, thinking of the unexpected legacy her choice had created. Her informal counseling practice had evolved into something approaching a movement, a network of people who understood that supernatural sensitivity was a gift rather than a pathology. The book she'd published, Between Worlds, Living with Supernatural Sensitivity, had become a quietly influential text among therapists, spiritual counselors, and anyone seeking to understand otherworldly experiences. More importantly, her children and grandchildren had grown up understanding that love could indeed transcend death, that the boundaries between worlds were more permeable than most people realized, and that some forms of consciousness might survive bodily death. This knowledge had made them more compassionate, more open to mystery, more capable of finding meaning in loss. "What will happen to your work when you're gone?" Ayanna asked. "It will continue," Rebecca said with quiet confidence. "I've trained dozens of people to do what I do. Dr. Elena Vasquez has established an academic program studying supernatural experiences. 3 of my former visitors have opened their own counseling practices for people with psychic sensitivity. The bridge I've built between worlds has become a highway." As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca felt the presence of other spirits gathering around the cabin, not just the ancient guardians, who had always watched over these mountains, but newer arrivals. Souls of people she had helped during her years of service, spirits who had found peace through her guidance and now waited to express their gratitude. Among them, she sensed Thomas, not as the grieving widow's desperate projection she had once feared, but as a genuine presence finally able to communicate across the veil that separated life from whatever came after. "You chose well, my love," his voice whispered through the gathering spirits. "You honored our marriage by remaining capable of specific love while serving universal purposes. You've become everything I hoped you might, and more than I could have imagined." The reunion with Thomas felt like coming home after a long journey to foreign countries. Their love had evolved beyond the romantic attachment of their mortal marriage into something deeper and more enduring, a connection that honored both their individual growth and their eternal bond. "Will I see you again?" Rebecca asked Ayanna, as the night deepened around them. "When your transformation is complete, yes," he promised, "but not as we are now. You'll be moving beyond the realm where guardians dwell, into whatever lies beyond even our understanding. I may not see you again until my own vigil ends and I choose to follow the path you're about to take." Rebecca felt a deep peace settling over her as she prepared to say goodbye to the warrior who had loved her across centuries, who had offered her immortality and accepted her refusal with grace, who had taught her that some forms of love were indeed stronger than death. 6 months later, on a morning when Emma was visiting with her mother, Rebecca woke to find Ayanna standing beside her bed. His presence filled the room with the scent of sage and the sound of distant flute music, and she understood that her time had come. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Rebecca looked around the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, where she had raised her children, where she had counseled countless people seeking to understand their supernatural experiences. Every object held memories, every corner echoed with laughter and tears, and the daily miracles of ordinary life. "Yes," she said peacefully, "I'm ready." As her breath slowed and her heartbeat faded, Rebecca felt herself lifting free from the body that had carried her through 87 years of human existence. The transition was as gentle as falling asleep, as natural as releasing a held breath. The last thing she saw in the mortal world was Emma standing in the doorway, her small hand waving goodbye to someone only she could see. The first thing she perceived in whatever realm came next was a vast gathering of souls, every person she had helped, every spirit she had comforted, every consciousness that had been touched by her choice to remain human while serving as a bridge between worlds. And somewhere in that infinite assembly, she sensed Thomas waiting to continue their love story in whatever form consciousness could take beyond the boundaries of life and death. Rebecca Matthews had whispered to the wind in her grief, and received an answer that transformed not just her own existence, but the lives of countless others who had struggled to understand that love, indeed, could transcend any boundary the universe might impose. Her legacy lived on in the mountains she had served, in the people she had helped, and in the knowledge that sometimes the most profound choice is not between life and death, but between different ways of honoring the mystery of love itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.